In this video, we're going to show how to return custom claims from an API endpoint and have them included in access tokens. So let's get started with a very simple Node.js API. This API has a single HTTP GET operation. The identity server will pass in the subject claim, and we will return 2 custom claims from the API. So we're dealing with an orders scenario here, where we're going to use these claims to authorize access to orders. The first claim is a user ID, which will be used to ensure that the user can only see their own orders. And the second claim is a user role, because some types of users, such as an admin, may be able to see all of the orders. So a very simple API. As we can see, it's running over localhost 3000. It's also using basic authentication. So the idea is that this API runs in a lockdown backend along with the identity server, and typically that would be in Kubernetes or that type of environment. And we're passing in a simple user and password in order to authenticate the request. So we can actually test this API if we run it with npm start. We can test this API from a simple curl request. If I just run curl -u to send in the user and password, call the claims endpoint, and we'll use the JQ tool to visualize the response. As we can see, the claims are coming back from the API. In a real API, you would typically look up the subject in a database and work out the claims based on your business logic. But a very simple scenario, and the identity server will call the API in exactly the same way later on when we get it configured. Next, we need a way to test our custom claims issuing, and we're just going to use the browser for this, and we're going to use auth tools. But first of all, let's have a look at our web client. So the web client has an auth tools callback URL. Under capabilities, it's using the code flow, and it's also using introspection so that we can look at what's inside a token in auth tools. So let's give this a go before any custom claims are issued, and we'll run an authorization redirect. You'll notice here that I'm using a very simple authenticator called the username authenticator. This is useful for testing because it's quick. So I'm just going to enter any username in here, and then I'll be authenticated. If we look at the server response, we'll see that we've received an authorization code. So next we need to swap that for tokens by clicking the redeem button. If we scroll down, we'll see that we now have some tokens returned. The access token is actually an opaque value, so the claims are actually stored in the server state rather than in the token itself. And up here we can introspect the token to see what's inside it. So at the moment they're just very standard claims, and our next job is going to be to get the custom claims from our API coming back in this payload. The next thing to do is to configure our custom claims and scope within the Curity identity server. So let's return to our Node.js API, and we can see we've got 2 claims called user ID and user role. So we can configure those under the claims section. Let's create the first one called user ID, and if we scroll down, we need to say where the claim will be issued, and we're going to issue it only in access tokens, since the value is only used by APIs to authorize order requests. Later we'll return to this section, the claim source, and I'll explain that shortly. But let's do the same thing for the user role. Incidentally, if you want to, you can use different names for the claim in the API and identity server, but we're going to keep things quite simple. And again, this claim only goes into the access token. So next we're going to create our scope. We're going to be very explicit about what this means by calling it orders read, and we will add the claims under this scope. So this is the idea in the Curity identity server, is that we can have a scope composed of claims. It's worth being aware that the claims can be included within multiple scopes. So you might use user ID in 3 different scopes potentially. And typically the final thing to do would be to add the scope to the client. So if I find my demo web client and go to OAuth settings and scroll down and make sure we include orders read, and then I can commit those changes. So now the scopes and claims are fully configured and we can move on to the next step. So far we've created a custom scope and composed it of claims. A key thing about claims is that they have runtime values that need to be assigned, because claims tend to be different depending on which user is logged in. So we're going to populate these claim values from our API at runtime, and this will be done via a claim source here. But before we can get that working, we need to connect Identity Server to our custom API. So the way in which we do that is there's two steps. First, we're going to create an HTTP client. So we create a new HTTP client, and we're going to call this custom API. And if we return to our Node.js API for a minute, we're using basic authentication over an HTTP URL. So we're going to configure settings that match that. So let's come in here and say basic authentication. As we can see, we've got ID server user and a secret value. So we'll type those in here. Check that's correct. And for demo purposes, we're just using HTTP. So the role of the HTTP client is to look after the connection. It deals with the security of the connection, which in our case is just basic authentication. And it can also deal with reliability, things like alarms. You can read more about this in the developer documentation. So the second stage of getting our API connected is to create a custom data source. So we are going to call this custom API again. And there's a number of different types of data sources for looking at claims. For example, you can connect to a database via JDBC or LDAP. We're going to do it the microservices way, and we're going to use a JSON data source, and we're going to enter values here that match our API. So again, we're running over localhost 3000. So let's enter those values. And if we scroll down, then we'll select our custom API client, and the path we're using is this one here, and we can copy and paste this into here, and that's our API connection all configured. So it will send basic credentials, it will call this path, and it will send in the runtime subject of the user who's logged in. So I can commit those changes. Finally, I need to go into claims providers. This is an abstraction that enables us to give the claims a runtime value. Again, we'll select data source and we'll select our custom API. There we go. And the one thing left to do is to actually give our claims runtime values now. So now that we've done all of that, we can select the custom API option, and what we're saying now is that we need to map the field from the payload through to the claim value. So the field in the payload is called user ID, and the claim value is also user ID. So these can be different if you prefer. We'll do the same for user role, custom API, user role. There you go, and we'll commit all of those changes, and our identity server configuration is now fully complete. So the only thing left to do is to retest our solution now that we've completed the configuration. So if we return to OAuth tools, the one thing we need to do is to include our new scope, the orders read scope, because this contains the custom claims that will trigger the call to our API. So let's start with an authorization redirect. Again, we'll log in as our test user, and we'll redeem that authorization code to get some tokens, and finally we'll introspect the access token. As can be seen, we've got two new claims in the access token, the user role and the user ID. And if we return to our API, we'll see that it's being called with the runtime subject. So all quite easy when you know how. So in the Curity identity server, there's quite a few moving parts, but that actually gives you a lot of flexibility in how you get hold of claims values. And it's worth being aware of also that the claims we've dealt with here are simple values, a number and a string, but you can use more complex types such as an array or an object if you need to. Just return them from your API and they'll be included in access tokens in that form. And to summarize, it's worth talking about the benefits of doing things this way. Your API will have the user role and user ID readily available, which will make your authorization code simpler. And the other benefit is that it's a more secure way of doing things because the claims you're using in your API's code are received in a digitally verifiable JOT, and that's good secure practice. So I hope everything made sense. Thank you very much for listening.